Well, welcome to US National Team Greco-Roman Leadership and Character Development Show. I'm here with Rick Adante, and we have a very special guest that we're honored to have, Captain Charlie Plumb. Rick, you want to introduce Charlie to us?
Sure. Welcome, Captain Plumb. It's a true honor to have you here. So, for any of the listeners and people tuning in, this is usually a wrestling show, but we've had neuroscientists on, we've had UFC fighters on, and today we have a true honor of hosting who is a true American hero, a real living legend. So, Captain Charlie Plumb, I'll read a little bit of a bio from him and hand it over to him so you can kind of introduce his story. But he was a graduate of the US Naval Academy and was one of the original inventors of Top Gun. And on his 75th mission flying F-4 Phantoms over Vietnam, received a surface-to-air missile hit to his aircraft and ejected over Vietnam and was captured. And Captain Charlie Plumb spent the next 2,103 days in confinement and imprisonment as a POW in the notorious Hanoi Hilton during the Vietnam War, where he suffered torture, isolation, confinement, yet still found a way to serve his teammates as chaplain for the other POWs. He was then one of less than 600 POWs to make it out of Vietnam, and was awarded the Silver Star, the Bronze Star, 2 Purple Hearts, a Legion of Merit, a Presidential Unit Citation, Combat Action Ribbon, the POW Medal for his service. Upon returning to the United States, Captain Plumb wrote an autobiography called I'm No Hero, now in its 33rd printing, that shed light on the plight of the prisoners of war in Vietnam. And if you want a copy, you can get one from his website, and it says he'll even be glad to personalize it with his autograph. So there's not enough that can be said about him, his service, his bravery, and everything he's done for our nation. But with that, I want to introduce Captain Charlie Plumb and let him share a little bit about his story.
Rick, thanks a lot. That's a great introduction, and probably makes me out to be a little bit bigger than I really am. So I'm just kind of the average guy that, I grew up in Kansas. I was a farm kid. I'd never seen the ocean. I'd never ridden in an airplane. At age 17, I graduated from high school and got an appointment to Annapolis, to the Naval Academy. I had no idea what I was getting into, but I stood there on the bricks of Tecumseh Court in Bancroft Hall at the United States Naval Academy and pledged to defend the Constitution of the United States against all enemies, foreign and domestic. And I'm 17 years old, just green as can be. So I learned a lot at the Naval Academy. I graduated with an engineering degree. But I learned an awful lot more about leadership and about humanity and about taking care of yourself and your troops in challenging times. So I married my high school sweetheart, a lovely blonde girl from Kansas, under the Arch of Swords. My buddies were holding up their swords. And so we went to flight training in Pensacola, Florida, then Beeville, Texas, and Meridian, Mississippi, where my flight instructor was John McCain. And was later to meet him in the prison camps as well. But I got assigned to the hottest airplane in the world at the time, the F-4 Phantom jet. It's a Mach 2 plus airplane. It's 1,400 miles an hour. And of course, it was designed for naval operations. So I learned to land on aircraft carriers and was launched on the aircraft carrier Kitty Hawk from San Diego, California. I waved goodbye to my wife, and in fact, it was her birthday. Bad timing. And so I promised her I'd be back in 8 months. And took me a little longer than that. As you said, I flew 74 successful combat missions over there, and I was 5 days from the end of my tour of duty, 5 days from going home. When my co-pilot, guy in my back seat, and I were hit by a surface-to-air missile, it exploded to some 12,000 pounds of jet fuel, sent that bird topsy-turvy, end over end. This is a big airplane. This thing weighs 60,000 pounds at takeoff. And I ejected, my co-pilot ejected, our parachutes opened, and we came floating down over enemy territory. So that 90 seconds, I went from king of the skies to scum of the earth. And I didn't know what I was getting into. Again, my co-pilot ejected, and he was not a quarter of a mile away from me, and so he was gonna make it out okay as well. I was surrounded by a bunch of villagers. They were shooting at me while I was still in the parachute, which I thought wasn't fair at all. You know, they just knocked down my multi-gazillion-dollar jet fighter. Yeah, they're shooting at the pilot. But they didn't hit me, and so I came down rather unscathed. Had some burns and cuts and things. I was captured immediately, hauled into the prison camp in Hanoi, tortured for 2 days for military information and political propaganda. Tossed into a little cell that was 8 feet long and 8 feet wide, and that was going to be my life for a while. Now I was in several different cells while I was there, but the first one was 8 by 8. And I was in solitary confinement there for, I don't know, a few months, not long. Some guys were in solitary for 4.5 years. That record was held by Jerry Denton, who was shot down as a commander after we were repatriated. He achieved the rank of admiral and then went on to be a senator from Alabama. So he did very well. So I was while I was in solitary, you know, and to talk about confinement and restricted, I was pretty restricted. No books to read, no window to look out, no telephone, radio, email, BlackBerry, Bluetooth, you know, cell phone. I didn't have anything. Not a pencil or a piece of paper for nearly 6 years. So what happens is in a situation like that, when you are confined, is you come up with other ways to occupy your mind and your body. I knew right up front that I was going to have to stay healthy mentally and physically if I was going to survive all this. And so I started, you know, looking for ways to exercise my body and my mind. After just a few weeks, I gained contact with a prisoner in a cell, not next to mine, but across a storeroom. This guy, Bob Shoemaker, pieced together little bits of wire and stuffed them out a hole in his cell wall across this storeroom between our 2 prison cells. He fished that wire over the boxes, around the shovels, and finally into the little rat hole on my cell wall, and passed a code written on a piece of toilet paper in ink made from ashes and brick dust. And the note said, memorize this code, then eat this note. Well, I memorized the code. It was a 5 by 5 box of the alphabet, A, B, C, D, E, then F, G, H, I, J, where any letter would be represented by the number of the line, then the number of the row. So A was 1, 1, so there'd be 1 tug, 1 more tug. Z was 5, 5. We left out K, so Z was 5 down, 5 across, 5 tugs, 5 more tugs. Very cumbersome code, as you might suspect, but it became our language. In fact, it became our lifeblood. It was absolutely vital, you know, that we communicate with the other guys. And the important part of that, I believe, and especially as it relates to our confinement today, you know, when so much of our nation, so much of the world, as a matter of fact, is confined to our homes or even a bedroom. Or the key to communication and survival wasn't the message we were passing around, wasn't the top secret escape plans. That was not the important part. The life or death property of communication in a prison camp, I think in daily life, is the simple validation of another human being. Because in the prison cells, when it was dark and you were alone, you lose track. Wouldn't know what was a real memory, what's a hallucination. You know, your mind starts to play tricks on you. And sometimes you really wonder if you're even alive or dead because there's no sounding board, there's no feedback. Nothing to tell me that I'm alive. So the simple tug on a wire and to have that wire tug back meant 2 things. Number one, somebody's responding to something I'm doing physically, thus I exist. And number two, somebody cares. And so in this day and age when, we would probably say that the greatest achievement of all time is we can pass a packet of data from one cell phone around the world to another cell phone, I really believe that the secret to survival and the secret to communication is to validate other people. It's the old adage that they don't care how much you know until they know how much you care. Well, so that started a communication with this guy, Bob Shoemaker, and he'd been there for 2 years when I showed up. He was one of the longest held prisoners of war, over 8 years in a prison camp. He returned and did okay too. He's a retired admiral now, but he sure set me straight, because on the communication, the first thing I did was to start to complain about my situation. I blamed the president for starting the war. I blamed the enemy for torturing prisoners, and blamed the mechanic that put my airplane together. And he said, you're in an 8-foot cell, but your real restriction is the 8 inches between your ears. You're in a mental box, and you're not going to survive unless you get out of that mental box. And I said, he said, what do you mean? He said, well, if you find yourself in this prison blaming everybody else, feeling sorry for yourself, going into the woe is me mode of life, building up all of this hate and discontent and vitriol inside you, it's not going to hurt the enemy at all. In fact, it's going to kill you. And I decided that, at that moment, that I was probably going to live through this, but if I died, it wasn't going to be, suicide. I wasn't going to kill myself with this attitude. They were going to have to work pretty hard to drag me out of their feet first. And so it gave me kind of an impetus of, hey, what can I do? Now, I also had a wonderful mother that I grew up with, just a Saint Teresa kind of a lady. And she would tell me, she said, in every situation in your life, in every one that you meet in life, you're going to see good things and bad things. She would say the secret to life is to search for the good things. It's like a puzzle. If there can be good things within any experience, then go find it, And I thought, I'm going to challenge my mother, because what in the world good could come out of being a prisoner of war and going through all of this? But she was right. And Shoemaker was right. There was a study done about 4 years ago of all the combatants of Vietnam. There are like 1.5 million people exposed to that war. 30.6% have post-traumatic stress disorder, PTSD. Of the prisoners of war, 4% of us have PTSD, and it's mostly the guys who were shot down near the end of the war and were not tortured and were only prisoners for a few weeks or a month or two. So, when you consider post-traumatic stress, what more stress could you be under than being a prisoner of war? But it doesn't have to be a disorder. In fact, there's kind of a new paradigm they call it PTG, post-traumatic growth. It's how you grow through these stressful experiences, and I'm one of the poster boys for post-traumatic growth. But so are the other guys. 591 of us came home, and they thought we'd be in baskets. They thought we'd be vegetables. They had us written off. They had our families briefed to institutionalize us for the rest of our lives. Well, from 591 men, we have produced 17 generals and 7 admirals. Most of us retired as senior grade military officers. We went back to flying airplanes, as I did, commanding ships and battalions and squadrons and all over the world. We have 2 United States senators from our number, 2 ambassadors from our number, a governor, several mayors, a vice presidential candidate, and a presidential candidate from these 591 guys. And they're telling us today we're healthier mentally and physically than if we hadn't been shot down. So I think Mom was right. There's an advantage in every situation you go through. And as bad as it looks, with COVID-19 right now, and how the world and our nation seem to be in a panic, I am convinced that there will be positive things that will come from this experience. Well, so I was there for just short of 6 years, was repatriated, came home to find that high school sweetheart that I had married at the Naval Academy had filed for divorce 3 months before I came home. She was engaged to be married to another guy. And so, another little turnaround in my life story. And again, I'll never forget laying in that hospital bed at Great Lakes Naval Hospital near Chicago and curled up in the fetal position, thinking to myself, Mom, can you possibly be right about this? I dreamed of this lady for 6 years, and now I come home and all my dreams are shattered. What good can come from this? Well, as you mentioned, I picked up my boots and got on with life, wrote a book, started to promote the book, started to speak. I've spoken over 5,000 times in every state in 27 foreign countries. And I live the life of Riley. I just flew in here in my own little airplane. I have 2 airplanes, as a matter of fact, an antique from World War II and an experimental airplane. I have a sailboat and just live a wonderful, gratifying, comfortable life. I'm married and have 4 kids and 4 grandkids. And so, these kinds of challenges that we face personally, the physical restriction challenges that we face, and the challenges that kids face. I know that you've got a lot of the wrestlers looking at this, and a lot of kids that are interested in what you guys are doing, and you're doing great things. And while they've not been through a crisis like this, I think I am living proof that you can endure, you can overcome, you can actually pull yourself through these things and be better off because of the challenge you faced.
Wow.
Amazing story. I mean, you're absolutely an optimist. I mean, I've listened to some of your podcasts that you've done with other people, and I got a kick out of when you said, well, I might get home before the guys on the ships because, we're injured and we're POWs. We might get out of here, but that was 6 years later. But you did have that positive attitude that whole time, and everything you said. I had the opportunity to walk 8 feet in my cell, and looking at those things as opportunities instead of obligations or any other frame mind. So how do you change that in your mind? How do guys learn from you how to change that mindset?
I talk to myself a lot. I'm my own coach, and when I see myself, getting negative about things, I say, wait a minute, Charlie. You just went through 6 years and you proved to yourself that the positive attitude is really the way to live. Why are you acting like this? In fact, in a lot of my speeches, I talk about this stuff, and at the end of the speech, I'll say, hey, thanks for listening for the last 45 minutes or an hour, but while you've been sitting there watching me, I've been sitting up here talking to myself. This is my therapy. This is, if I'm going to practice what I preach, then I'm preaching to myself. And this is the way that I stand up, get back up after I've been knocked down. So, a lot of it is just because of my experience. Now, I was a positive guy before I went into the prison, but I think that experience just validated the value of a positive attitude.
How can guys develop that positive attitude if they're like kind of generally, they're not positive guys. They're always the guys that are like, oh man, I got to do this and this is terrible. And how do they develop that positive attitude?
Good question. I think that you develop a negative attitude when you think you don't have any choices. When the coach puts you on the sideline, or when you get some kind of an injury, or anything that happens to you. you think that your surroundings are controlling your destiny. And one of the real keys, I think, and I'm not the first guy to come up with this, this is historically, you see people that have come through great challenges in their life. Look at Nelson Mandela or Jesus, for goodness sakes, it's almost Easter. The people that have gone through tremendous challenge in their life. And when you go through that challenge, your immediate thought is something terrible is happening to me and I cannot change this. And so you go into a panic mode and you start to look for people to blame and you look for excuses to make. And if you can really believe that, no, I have the choice, I am in control of my destiny, I'm the captain of my soul. If you can really believe that and tell yourself that, hey, this is on me. This is not on anybody else. I can't blame anybody else for this situation, but I can make something of myself because of the challenge I face.
I think that's super positive. And then you talk about people that pack your parachute as well. So like, first of all, it starts with you and your belief, and then how do you allow others to serve and because some of us are prideful and we don't need the help. We don't need that. I'm going to do this on my own, so we can take it too far one way or the other. Super negative or super, it's all on me. I got to do this myself. How did you learn those lessons and share that with us?
Well, let me tell you about an experience that happened after I came home. In fact, it was several years, maybe 10 or 12 years after I was repatriated from the prison camp. And I was in a restaurant in Kansas City where I lived, and about 2 tables over, a guy kept looking at me, and I caught his eye, but I didn't recognize this gent. He stood up from his table, came over to my table, pointed at me, and said, "You're Captain Plumb." And I looked up at this guy, and he said, "You flew jet fighters in Vietnam. You're a fighter pilot. You were shot down from the aircraft carrier Kitty Hawk. You parachuted in the enemy hands, and you spent 6 years as a prisoner of war." Well, I was dumbfounded. The best I could do was stagger to my feet, reach out a very grateful hand of thanks. He came up with just the proper words. He said, "I packed your parachute." Well, I didn't know what to say, but thanks. And we got into a discussion that night. He was a very humble guy and said, I'm not the only one that packed your parachute. He said, "I did the physical parachute, but you've had a lot of people in your life that gave you the strength to overcome this adversity in your life. Your mom, your dad, preachers, teachers, coaches, people in your life that have inspired you and given you those nuggets that allowed you to survive. Those are parachute packers." And so I look for people in my life that really want to help me, that have my best interest as their best interest. And they're all over the place. Those parachute packers are all over. But I will tell you that the night that I met that guy, I went back home and I couldn't sleep because I wondered how many times I might have passed that sailor in the passageway of that ship, or maybe how many times I'd seen him out on a Liberty call, and I'd never, I never said thank you or anything, because actually I was an officer, I was a fighter pilot, he was just a lowly sailor in the bowels of the aircraft carrier putting these parachutes together. Until one day I had to use that parachute that he packed and saved my life. So I would encourage the folks that have that kind of pride, and I certainly understand that. There's a lot of braggadocio and being a Navy fighter pilot, and I certainly understand how people want to be their own person and do their own thing and stand alone and make your own way in life. But I can tell you that you really can't do it alone. No man is an island. We all need each other. And I think, especially in times like this, there's nobody can fight this disease by ourselves. we need the doctors, we need the scientists, we need the nurses, and we need the guy that mops the floor in the hospital, to all these servants around us. And so I would encourage your folks to tap in to that resource, because you not only, you not only help yourself out when somebody else is helping you, but it gives them gratification as well. And so, you build that connect, you build that team, even in accepting help from other people.
So that's something that struck me when you were telling that story, was you talked about all these people who packed your parachute. It wasn't just him, but at the same time, you actually pulled the ripcord. You were willing to accept the help, right? Maybe not consciously thinking about it in that term at the time, but we talk a lot about it with developing young athletes and young men and women on the show, and in terms of being open to actually asking and accepting the help, and realizing that there are people mopping the floors or helping and coaching, and that there are those parachute packers all around us. Because for example, Matt's team, the national team, it's a very diverse group where you've got guys who are Naval Academy and we have a strong military component. They're strongly involved and supported by the Army and the Marines, and a lot of the Marines came from the Naval Academy. They kind of have that team mindset by the time they show up. And then there's other guys come from college or from high school, and we have a very sort of motley crew of diversity, where we try to communicate to people that to one, recognize that there are those parachute packers, there are these people that are all part of the team, but sometimes beyond just acknowledging, we got to ask for help, and we got to use it when it's offered.
There's no question about that. And sometimes you have to ask for help. And that's a tough thing to do lots of times, because folks don't just stand in line, wanting to help you out. Sometimes you have to expose your need. And, I'm a big believer in humility. I think that, sure, you can be a strong person, you can be a superstar, but if you can't, if you can't accept the fact that you're a flawed person, just like everybody else is a flawed person, and that you can use some the benefit of other people in your life. If you can't do that, you're probably not going to make it very far.
So can I ask you a couple questions about
Sure.
your story and confinement? I'm a psychologist. I'm a professor for psychology at Cal State, and I've done a little bit of confinement through some studies at NASA. But nowhere by any stretch, you guys would snicker at the small amount of time that we put in. So
listen, 45 days, right? That's how long you were confined.
That was the length of the mission, but we actually had an emergency abort at only 23 because we were in the middle of Hurricane Harvey.
Okay.
So we got a little bit of realism in there, but
it's interesting because some of the POWs would come back and were shot down near the end of the war, and they don't really consider themselves POWs because they weren't there long enough. It's really silly, but I believe that when they close that cabin door on you guys, just one day of that confinement, and you realize you can't get out. You don't have a doorknob on the inside of the door anymore. And so, no, I think you qualify for that, Rick.
Yeah, and one of the things on that we noticed is like time slows down a little bit, right? So like a day seemed like a week, and a week was like a month, and a month was like a year, and so everything kind of gets tilted a little bit in terms of your perceptions, and then you don't, and we were a sleep deprivation mission too, so it was, you had a little bit of, some things were real in your mind and some things weren't, and I actually went through the same thing, kind of like you had mentioned, where for the first couple of days I had a negative attitude, and I started getting frustrated with a couple of things that were going wrong, and we had to flip that switch where I realized this thing is going wrong, and I'm frustrated. I'm like, somebody should have tested this before they started the mission. And I realized that's what I'm doing. I'm the monkey having to test it, and so have a good attitude, because we're actually testing it for the real people in space, and that fundamental shift in attitude became positive, and anything that went wrong became seen in a positive light. We just found a weak link at the chain. Now we know what to fix for the real guys, and now it became a game and we engaged your mind in staying positive. And, so when you talked about, some of those challenges, and, it's not always easy to stay positive. And when some of those sort of threats creep into the mind, how do you manage that? Because a lot of times what we see now, right, with the coronavirus thing is people weren't, you were on your mission. People were just going about their lives. All of a sudden, they're like, hey, stay in the house. And there's a lot of people who weren't prepared. They didn't go through SEER. They didn't do other things. And they have teammates or family members that might be getting on their nerves a little bit, or lack the self-awareness of realizing maybe I'm getting on someone's nerves. What do
No
you
question.
offer as some tips?
The First of all, I think to be a psychologically healthy person, you need a purpose. You need a mission in life. And what happens when you can't go to your job anymore, and you can't sit at a desk in your office, or you can't, drive a truck or whatever your job is, you lose that purpose. And we see it in the military when guys retire, and there's just a terrible suicide rate with retired military people. And I think that, when you're in the military, there's no question of what your purpose is, and if you ever wonder about your purpose, ask your drill instructor, and they'll tell you what your purpose is. And there's no question when you're wearing that uniform. You take the uniform off, and you seem like you don't have a purpose anymore. And that leads, I believe, to suicidal thoughts. And I think it's the same thing with shelter in place and the restrictions that we face now with this virus. That when people come home and are in a different environment, and they're not on that day-to-day schedule where they have deadlines, and they have goals and aspirations during the day, that's all gone, and now they don't have a purpose. And I think that one of the things that everybody needs to do is find a purpose. And if that means staying at home, learning to play the guitar, if that means filing through those thousands of pictures you've got on your cell phone and making an album out of them, or find something that you can achieve on your own. It doesn't have to be a big deal, it doesn't have to. You don't have to invent a marvelous machine. Just find a purpose in your life other than that purpose you had when you went to work. And I think schedule is really important as well. I think that once you lose that framework, that discipline of scheduling things, and if you sit around in your pajamas all day on the couch watching TV, I think that's where we get into trouble. We start to wonder, who am I and why am I here? Whereas if you can get dressed, do something of value, find a mission in life, and maybe it's just, maybe it's calling your mom if you're lucky enough to have one, or emailing friends, or helping out. My wife and I are going to spend this weekend making masks. She's a seamstress, and we've got the pattern, and so we're going to be cutting out all kinds of cotton material and making masks. Our son's girlfriend is in the medical field, and she's asked us, for 100 masks, and so that's what we're going to do. And so, finding a mission like that, a purpose, I think really goes a long way in helping you to get away from the boredom humdrum of life.
That's really interesting, really helpful too. So it reminds me of something you mentioned earlier, which was, you said your lifeblood at the time was communication with the guys. And once that happened, that created that lifeblood, because it allowed you to realize and validate that somebody cares about you. And so when you talk about a purpose in these sort of confinements, and this is something that I kind of adopted in our mission too, was making it my purpose to serve others, kind of like a service leadership model. So if you're cooped up in your apartment or your house, Matt's on a beautiful plot of land up in Oregon, but there's a lot of people down here in like Southern California that they can't leave their apartment. There's nowhere else to go. Would people can take that approach, make it their purpose to keep the other people around them happy, or to adopt something like that where you can allow that humility to kind of keep you in check, but also that communication to be the lifeblood of maybe managing that. Because one thing I wanted to ask you is this kind of distinction between isolation and confinement, because they're a little bit different, right? You can be confined with one or two other people and it has its own challenges, but isolation is also, a little bit different sometimes too, because we need that communication. And how do you see that? And for each of those kind of categories, is there something that your expertise in each domain would maybe lend to people who are in an apartment by themselves and they don't have family and friends around, and then some other people who might be in a place with 2, 3, 4 family members who might be getting on each other's nerves?
Mm-hmm. Absolutely. Well, and you probably found this, in the experiment that you were running, is that you learn to love and hate your cellmate, and sometimes the two happiest days was when they put you together with some guy, and you can't get more than 8 feet away from this guy, and you're smelling in him and you're listening to him, and you really you kind of learn to hate this guy. Then they take him out, and you're in solitary confinement, and you yearn, for somebody to talk to come back. When I was first in solitary, and I would say that this is more of the less confinement and more of the restriction. I started back through my mind. I decided I'm going to make an autobiography in my mind, and I went back through the very first memory that I had when I was 3 years old in Kansas, and tried to replay every book I'd ever read, every movie I'd ever seen, every girl I'd ever dated. I just went back through the entire thing. And I was 24 years old, and it took 3 months for me to capture every memory, I think, in my mind. And it was interesting because then after I thought I had totally recaptured everything in my memory, if I'd come across something which was new, I would spend the day just thinking about that specific thing, the colors and the sounds and the people and the conversations and all about that thing. So in that kind of confinement, when all you have is yourself, you go inward, you go into your mind. If you're lucky enough to have somebody, like a family member or a neighbor that you can talk to, they don't even have to be face to face. If you're on the phone or texting or emailing someone, that adds an awful lot to the variability of it all, because you can tell stories and they can tell stories. And in the prison camp, see, I was in solitary, then they gave me a roommate, then they took him away, then they gave me 3 roommates. We were 4 guys in an 8-foot by 8-foot cell. And so it was pretty cramped. But we all told all the stories. We taught each other foreign languages. We taught each other the courses we had taken in school. I taught a course in sailing, okay, in an 8-foot by 8 to these Air Force guys. We started out, we were all Navy, but then the Air Force started to build bases around Vietnam. And so at the end of the war, about 2/3 of the guys were Air Force. But these Air Force guys didn't know anything about the water or sailing or anything else. And so I taught them on a concrete floor with a piece of brick, as a chalk, and here's the wind, and here's the angle, and here's the point of sail, and this is what you do. and it was just kind of a way to keep our minds active. And so after I came home, it must have been like maybe only 2 weeks after I came home, get this call, from my buddy, Charlie, I just rented a boat. I know how to sail. So it's amazing what you can do in your mind when you don't have all the distractions, of daily life. It's quite an opportunity.
That's interesting.
It-
So we talk a
that-
lot about. Go ahead, Matt.
yeah, I just constantly hear him talking about these things that most people would think were just awful, and he says, "Oh, it was an opportunity. It was an opportunity," and I love that. But one of the other things I want to just and solitude, and what you think that if there is a difference between isolation and solitude, and what that is, because me and Rick had a podcast last week where we discussed what I thought solitude was, and the difference.
Well, that's a very good question. I really never thought about the difference between solitude and isolation. Um, I, you know, my first thought is that solitude is something you can bring upon yourself. Isolation is sort of something that's done to you. And you know, I, I revel in my solitude. I get up on my little airplane. My favorite thing is to go up at sunset, and I live in Southern California too, and I feel that at 5,000 feet, I'm one of the last guys on continental United States of seeing the sunset, because from 5,000 feet, it sets later.
Hmm.
And at sunset, it's very quiet up there, and not a lot of traffic, not a lot going on. And you just sit there in your little airplane and you just kind of cruise around. My mom, as I mentioned, was just Mother Teresa, and a very religious woman. And when I first got my Navy wings and came home and was so proud of that, and she said, "Son, when you fly so high, do you think you're closer to God?" And I thought, well, that's kind of silly. God isn't necessarily way up high in the sky. God is everywhere. Uh, and I sort of dismissed it as, this older lady that just didn't really understand. But the longer I live, the more I'm a believer that I am closer to God when I'm up there at 5,000 feet, because I can't see all the evil on the earth. I don't see the wickedness of the earth. It's all just beautiful blue sky and white clouds. So I'm not answering your question between isolation.
No, you actually are. You actually are.
Okay.
Because what I described solitude was it's a choice, first of all, which
Right.
you said,
Right.
and the other one was you're not alone. Maybe you're with God,
Yeah. That's a good point.
and you choose that. You choose to spend this time. That was my thought, but hearing you describe it, it sounds just like the same definition I had.
Yeah. Good.
So I have a question for you, sir,
Okay.
if you don't mind. I've lost,
Sure.
but
No.
one thing
Sure.
you just said is you talked about when you feel like you're flying and you're closer to God, and I remember even just right. I remember that feeling, right, when you're flying alone and solo. When I was working on my private license, or maybe right after, I was thinking about getting serious with who's now my wife, and I'd be up there, kind of like the Thomas Crown Affair scene, where he's just flying, thinking, and there's that solitude and that closeness. But you also mentioned that it's a way a little bit further from the evil of the worlds, and you're a man who's faced real evil and real I mean torture and trauma and and all the worst things that can happen to a human being. And something that strikes me is certainly your positivity about it, but you know how do you process that evil at the time? How do you find a resolve? Because I know that historically there's been sort of a reckoning I've read about in online about guards and prisoners over time making peace. And something that we talked about last week about confinement is I recommended that people really use it as an opportunity to practice forgiveness. Um, when you're with teammates, because they're going to get on their nerves, and you've got to be able to forgive your other people in close quarters, and you've got to be able to forgive yourself, because you're going to screw up, you're going to make mistakes, and you can't beat yourself over it. but you really got to forgive others, especially when they're not forgiving you. So that's easy and trite for me to say, but somebody, you know, you and your comrades and teammates, how do you guys, what can we learn from you?
Well, I'm glad you brought that up. That's one of my favorite words is forgiveness. And I think the first several months of my experience, I was blaming everybody else, you know, for my challenge. I took no responsibility myself for it. And then, you know, we with this little code that we had, we'd pass through the wall Bible verses and patriotic quotes and stories, and you know, we would tell a movie, you know, and it would take all day to tell a movie with this silly code. But one of the quotes that turned me around was this one: acid does more harm on the subject it's poured than, I'm sorry, acid does more harm on the vessel it's stored than on the subject it's poured. The point is, if you harbor all of this negative discontent, all this acid within you, it's going to hurt you more than it's going to hurt the enemy. That's for sure. And so when it came to that realization that first of all, I had control, and that it was actually going to hurt me, and just by being so negative about the whole issue. And I remember after I'd heard that acid does more harm in the vessel it's stored than on the subject it's poured. I'm thinking, man, I don't think I'm going to die here, but I'm certainly not going to kill myself. So that's kind of the way that one worked.
Wow. So, you know, it reminds me of the other thing I wanted to ask too, because you mentioned that idea of post-traumatic growth and, you know, how you get through those traumatic experiences, you know, I mean, is amazing in its own right. You know, in the sport of wrestling, there's a wide variety of, you know, people's backgrounds, and there's some athletes who've gone through horrible things and have grown to become immense human beings, and
Mm-hmm.
vice versa, right? Just like lots of walks of life. Um, you know, we. So I wanted to ask, you know, going through that post-traumatic growth, you know, what were some of the things that you think helped lead to that sort of protective mechanism of what might have insulated some of the guys that were most at risk from that we might be able to take some tidbits from for these smaller situations that, you know, people across the country are confined, because some might be living in, you know, homes that, you know, have domestic abuse now and they can't get out, and there's a lot of things that could be, you know, bad that people are experiencing. How do we translate that into getting that post-traumatic growth?
I can see that that is a major issue, and it first of all, I think it takes leadership and it takes time, but I think that being an example, and both of you guys are just excellent examples of this, and I'm sure that your students and the people on your team look to you for that kind of guidance, and if you can just instill in them the fact that they have the choice. They can't change their surroundings, but they can sure change their attitude towards their surrounding. And what I learned is that once you figure this out, it's sort of a revelation. It's sort of a new way of living, a new way of thinking, and you just go from one situation to another, and you validate more and more as you go through life that this stuff really works. That there really is a good reason to be positive.
I've heard that from even astronauts when they come back from space. They'll say that they have something similar to that post-traumatic growth. There's less trauma naturally, but
Yep.
they come back with a bigger worldview because you've seen the world from a different vantage point, whether it was from like the bottom of a cell or the top of a orbit. You see that it's the world's much bigger and there's not the divisions that maybe are perceived oftentimes, and it has led to a lot of growth, and we came out of that from even our small thing where it's like, man, after disconnecting from society for so long, You hear about the squabbles or the little petty stuff that people are emailing about or arguing about, and it doesn't make sense. You're like,
Yeah.
there's so many. Just be good to people at the core. Just and I hope that as a nation, as a society, that's a good thing that can come out of this.
I think that's certainly. I think that's one thing that we're going to be will be different. We will learn to this, and that will be one of the positive parts that will come out of this whole experience. Is that there really is good that can come from that, and if you search for it, if you make a puzzle out of it, and you decide, hey, I'm going to find the good that will eventually come from this situation, then it all works together. So from a religious point of view, and I'm a man of faith, and that's a lot of what the Bible teaches as well. The Bible verse Romans 8:28 was really important to me in the prison cabinet. It says all things work together for good to those that love the Lord, and I'm thinking all things work together, all things, not just the good news, not just the fun part of life, but every part of life can work together for good. So that's that's my attitude. And I know that it's not always easy for people that are in bad situations, bad family situations, or go through challenges in their life. And sometimes it's tough for me because I obviously believe what I believe because of what I've been through. And when people complain about little things in life that to me are just incidental, um, and obviously I can't just stop and say, wait a minute, you can handle this. But I try to live my life and be and be a mentor to people who have those kinds of challenges, because I think they see me as a living, loving, happy individual that have been through some of the same kinds of challenges that everybody goes through.
It's truly inspirational. Like I remember I watched your podcast on the Jocko Willink show, and
Oh, yeah.
I remember I made my wife listen to it while we were driving down for the 5. I mean, we were just truly amazed and inspired. I mean, you inspire us with, and part of what I found so special wasn't just your positivity and your amazing outlook on it, but you connected with people and saying that you had your experience in your cell, but you recognize that everybody has their own cell, whether it's a prison of their mind or whatever's happening in their life, that's a big deal for them, right? And I think there's an old saying that like faith is kind of like a cup of water, and when you're little you have a small cup can quench your thirst, but as you grow up you need more and more, and your faith kind of has to grow. And I think to see people go through things that might seem like they're not a big deal, but it's a big deal for them. And there's a lot of even kids or people go, now they're missing life events, graduations, ceremonies that, we might look and be like, it'll be okay.
Yeah.
But it's a big deal for them.
Yeah,
and
absolutely.
What do you tell them from someone who went through that growth, who had, those years away from those events in your family, and then when you mentioned you were in the hospital bed and you found out about your wife at the time, and what can they take as kind of a guiding principle about managing that experience?
When I speak, sometimes I'll have people come up to me after my talk, and they'll say, I listened to your experience and I could never have gone through that myself. And especially if it's a woman and a mother, I'll say, have you been through childbirth? And they say, yes, yeah, I've got 3 kids. And I said, I've watched childbirth, and I can tell you that I could never go through that. And so it's all relative, it's all just how we feel about things. And I am convinced, that you can be in that prison, that 8-inch prison that I talk about. You can be in just as much of a prison and have the same kind of responses that I had to my prison. If you're, losing a job or staying home or diagnosed with a disease or losing a child, these are terrible things that can happen to you. And if you can, see it as an opportunity, if you can see it as, hey, there's value in there somewhere, you not only can live through it, but you can be better because of it.
You can have growth, like the people that you were with. Wow. Such an honor to have you on here. And I just want to remind everybody to go to charlieplumb.com and pick up his book. I'm not a hero, but he certainly sounds like a hero to me. But he's on the Twitter, he's on the Facebook, he's posted all kinds of videos out there on the YouTube channel. I'll put like him and sharing this video because I think this is the best podcast we've ever had for sure. And it was an honor to have you on here, Charlie. Thank you so much.
Thanks, Matt. A pleasure to be with you guys, and I really appreciate the conversation. And as Rick said from the beginning, I autograph every book that I send out of my office. So charlieplumb.com, happy to share it. I also answer every email that's sent to me as well. And that takes a lot of my time because I'm getting a lot of email these days. But I appreciate what the two of you do, and I'm really honored to be on your program.